I work as a food delivery driver for a small, struggling delivery service. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills, barely. After some recent financial setbacks, I'm just trying to stay afloat, doing my best to make ends meet by taking on the late-night shifts no one else wants. That's how I found myself out delivering food at nearly midnight last Friday, pushing through the fatigue and telling myself it was all just part of the grind. That night was slow, as most Fridays are. Around 11:30 p.m., when I was about to call it a night, a notification lit up my phone. One last order had come in. It was from a remote, isolated area on the outskirts of town, the kind of neighborhood people only go to if they live there. A strange chill crept down my spine as I accepted the order and read the customer's instructions. Leave the food at the front door and leave immediately. No need to knock or ring. It was weird, no doubt about it, but not unusual enough to refuse the order. Maybe they were just cautious or a little paranoid. I'd seen worse anyway. After all, in this job, you get used to dealing with all types of people and all sorts of strange requests. So I shrugged it off, started my GPS, and headed out into the darkness. The drive took longer than I'd expected, winding through narrow, poorly lit roads that seemed to stretch endlessly. There were no streetlights here, just endless trees, shadows, and the faint beam from my headlights. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my GPS announced I'd arrived. The house was set back from the road, cloaked in darkness with no signs of life anywhere. Even from my car, I could tell that this place was far from welcoming. The yard was overgrown, weeds swallowing up what little of the driveway was visible. The house itself was in shambles, with broken windows and a door that hung slightly ajar, swinging gently in the faint night breeze. A sense of unease crept over me, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was just a job, after all. I grabbed the bag of food, got out of the car, and walked toward the front porch, my footsteps echoing in the quiet of the night. The only sounds were my own movements and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The eerie silence felt suffocating, pressing in on me with each step. As I reached the porch, I was about to set the food down when the front door creaked open ever so slightly. No one stood in the doorway, yet the door had definitely moved on its own. I took a step back, heart pounding in my chest. My gut was screaming at me to leave, fast. But I had a job to do, so I quickly placed the bag on the porch, stepped back, and headed back to my car, practically jogging as I tried to distance myself from that house. That's when I noticed it. My tires, every single one of them, were flat. Not just low on air, but fully slashed with clean, deliberate cuts across the rubber. My pulse quickened as the realization sank in. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone didn't want me to leave. I looked around, scanning the shadows, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing by the side of the house, dressed in dirty clothes that hung loosely on his thin frame. He was watching me, his gaze unblinking and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Malice, perhaps, or something darker. As our eyes met, he started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, as if savoring every step. Panic flared in my chest. I scrambled back into my car, locked the doors, and dialed 911, my fingers trembling as I punched in the numbers. I told the dispatcher my location and situation, my voice barely steady. She assured me that help was on the way, but I knew it would take time. We were miles out from the nearest police station. While I was on the phone, the man reached my car. He raised his hand and rapped his knuckles against the driver's side window, a slow, taunting rhythm. I could hear him murmuring something through the glass, but the words were too faint to make out. His hand drifted over to the handle, testing it, as if he expected it to somehow unlock itself. I gripped my phone tightly, pressing it to my ear, as I tried to keep my breathing under control, but it didn't end there. From the darkness, more figures began to emerge. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as they drew closer, I realized it wasn't my imagination. 4 more figures were moving toward me, silent and deliberate, closing in on all sides. I was trapped. I whispered a frantic plea to the dispatcher, begging her to send help faster. She reassured me that the officers were on their way, but her words felt hollow. I was alone out here, at the mercy of these strangers with no clear intentions. Desperation clawed at my mind, and in a sudden burst of resolve, I decided I couldn't wait for the police. I had to get out of here. Now. I turned the key in the ignition, my heart hammering as the engine sputtered to life. Despite the slashed tires, I pressed down on the gas, feeling the car lurch forward with an agonizingly slow crawl. The wheels shrieked against the asphalt, metal grinding as the rims scraped the road. I couldn't go fast, but I could move, and that was enough. The figures followed, keeping pace with my crippled car, their dark silhouettes looming in the rearview mirror. I forced myself to keep driving, eyes fixed ahead as I fought the urge to look back, every nerve in my body screaming at me to go faster. Finally, I reached the end of the road, a brighter street looming ahead. I glanced back and saw the figures retreating into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had come. When I thought it was safe, I pulled over, jumping out of the car and breaking into a run. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit area, my lungs burning, legs shaking as I stumbled into the street. Headlights flooded my vision, and I turned to see a police car approaching, lights flashing. Relief washed over me, and I flagged them down, barely able to speak as I tried to explain what had happened. The officers took me back to the house, but by the time we arrived, there was no one there. The house was empty, silent, the eerie stillness settling back over the place like a blanket. They searched the property and found strange symbols scrawled on the walls, marks that seemed too deliberate to be random graffiti. But other than that, there was no sign of the figures, no evidence of the man who had terrorized me. As I finally left the scene, the reality of what had happened settled over me. I'd been minutes away from who knows what fate, trapped in a nightmare with no one to help. It was a night I wouldn't soon forget, a terrifying reminder that sometimes, even in the most ordinary job, horror can find you in the most unexpected places. It was supposed to be just another night on the job. Since losing my previous job a few months back, I'd been working as a driver for Uber Eats, picking up shifts wherever I could to make ends meet. The late-night hours were no one's first choice, but they paid extra, and money was tight. Tonight started like any other, but I could feel a strange unease as soon as I accepted my last delivery of the night. It was a small order, just a couple of sandwiches and drinks picked up from an all-night convenience store on the edge of town. The place was lit with flickering neon lights, casting an eerie glow across the parking lot as I waited for the order to be prepared. When I finally had the bag in hand and was ready to go, I did a quick double-check of the address. It wasn't an area I knew well, but I didn't think much of it. A lot of people ordered late-night food, and I was just here to make some extra cash. What could go wrong? As I pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed a car idling a short distance away. It was a dark sedan, a little beat up and unremarkable. The driver didn't seem to be paying attention to me, so I drove off, my eyes scanning the dark road ahead. About a block away, I caught sight of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another driver out late, maybe a night owl like me or a fellow Uber Eats driver. But as I took a couple more turns, I noticed the car sticking uncomfortably close. I wasn't panicking yet. I figured it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were headed in the same direction, right? But with each mile I drove, the car kept up, staying just close enough to make its presence known. My pulse began to pick up, and I told myself to stay calm. I wasn't one for paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. This wasn't a heavily populated area, just the outskirts of the city, dotted with trees and dark houses with few streetlights. The streets were empty. Trying to ease my nerves, I sped up, keeping my eyes on the road. But every time I changed my speed, the car behind me did the same. It was like a game of cat and mouse, only I was starting to realize I might actually be the mouse. Eventually, I reached the address listed on the delivery. It was a narrow, dimly lit street lined with overgrown trees and no signs of life. I pulled over to the curb, checking the address one last time. My follower hadn't pulled in behind me, but I could still see those headlights lingering at the far end of the street, like a predator waiting for its prey. I quickly got out of the car and jogged up to the front porch of a small, dilapidated house. The windows were dark, and there were no lights on inside. I hesitated before setting the bag down. It felt wrong, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. I quickly placed the bag on the doormat, snapping a photo for the app, and all but ran back to my car. The moment I was back inside and had locked the doors, I let out a sigh of relief. But when I glanced back down the road, my blood ran cold. The car was still there, idling, and now it was inching forward, coming closer and closer. My heart pounded as I gripped the wheel, my palms damp with sweat. I had to leave, and fast. I threw the car into drive and peeled away from the curb, my eyes darting to the mirror to watch the car behind me. But I didn't make it far before my car started to sputter. I felt a sudden jolt, and my heart dropped as I realized something was wrong with one of my tires. The car groaned, lurching as I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. As soon as I stepped out, I saw the issue. My back tire had gone flat. I cursed under my breath, anxiety creeping up my spine. In the distance, I could see the other car pulling over just a few yards behind me. The driver got out, and I could finally make out his silhouette in the headlights. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothing that seemed to blend with the shadows. His face was obscured, and as he moved closer, he raised a hand in what might have been a friendly wave. But there was something about his movements, a slowness that felt more like a deliberate stalking than an attempt to help. "Need some help with that tire?" he called out, his voice strangely calm, almost amused. Every instinct told me to decline, to tell him I had it under control. But as I opened my mouth to respond, he was already coming closer, his smile widening as he neared me. I felt trapped. My mind raced, looking for any way to escape. I had no tools, no means to fix the tire, and my phone's battery was in the red. "I'm fine, thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I took a step back toward the trees lining the road, hoping he wouldn't notice, but he did. His gaze followed me, his smile fading as he tilted his head slightly. There was a predatory gleam in his eyes, something cold and calculating. I had to get out of there. I took a deep breath, glancing toward the dark woods just a few feet away, and made a split-second decision. Without another word, I turned and bolted, sprinting into the shadows. Branches whipped at my face as I stumbled into the trees, my heart pounding louder with every step. I could hear him behind me, the crunch of leaves under his boots growing closer as I scrambled over roots and rocks in the pitch-black night. My chest burned, my legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to keep going, to put as much distance as possible between us. After what felt like hours, the sounds of his footsteps faded. I crouched low, pressing myself against the trunk of a large tree, holding my breath as I scanned the darkness. My car and all my belongings were out there, but I wasn't about to go back, not yet. After what felt like an eternity, I saw his figure emerge from the trees, moving toward my abandoned car. He rummaged through it, tossing out anything of value. I watched as he pocketed my phone and wallet, chuckling to himself before getting back into his car and driving off, leaving me stranded. I stayed hidden until I was certain he was gone. Only then did I stumble back to my car, my hands trembling as I realized the true extent of the trap I'd walked into. It hadn't been just a coincidence. That delivery, the flat tire, his sudden appearance, it was all part of his plan. Later, when I managed to get a ride and contacted the authorities, they assured me they'd look into it. They tracked him down eventually, but his punishment was mild, a slap on the wrist that barely scratched the surface of what he'd put me through. And all for what? A few stolen items and a twisted sense of control. Since then, I haven't taken another late-night shift. The memory of that night, those cold eyes and that cruel smile still haunts me. I survived, but I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted on those dark roads, alone and vulnerable in the shadows. Back when I was 18, I got a part-time job as a delivery driver for a popular burger joint in my hometown. It was one of those jobs I figured I'd do for a year or so before moving on to something better. The shifts were pretty standard. Some nights were slow, while others had me running around town non-stop. But I didn't mind the busy nights. They made the hours fly by. One Saturday evening, I was scheduled for a late shift from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. It was unusually busy that night, with orders coming in one after another. By 8 p.m., I was exhausted, but I still had a few more deliveries to make before I could take a break. My manager handed me 3 orders, all going to different addresses, with the last one being a cash-on-delivery order, which was rare for our place. The first 2 deliveries went smoothly, and I was finally on my way to the last address. The GPS led me out of town, toward the more remote suburbs where the houses were few and far between. The sky had turned dark, and the streetlights were sparse, casting long shadows on the empty roads. The address took me to a narrow gravel road surrounded by thick woods on either side. I hesitated for a moment but pushed on, figuring it was just another secluded house. After a few minutes of driving, I reached the end of the gravel road. The house I was looking for was hidden behind a line of overgrown bushes. It was a small, weathered building with no lights on. The whole place looked like it hadn't been maintained in years, with peeling paint and windows covered in grime. I parked the car and got out, grabbing the food bag. As I approached the front porch, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. I called out, "Hello, delivery!" But there was no response. I thought about just leaving the bag on the porch, but since it was a cash order, I needed someone to pay for it. Reluctantly, I knocked on the door, which creaked open further. That's when I noticed the faint sound of whispering coming from somewhere inside. My instincts told me to turn around and leave, but I pushed the feeling aside, thinking I was just being paranoid. I called out again, louder this time, but the whispering stopped abruptly. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway, a middle-aged man with a pale face and disheveled hair. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I forced a smile and told him the total for the order. The man nodded slowly and disappeared back into the darkness of the house, leaving the door wide open. I stood there waiting, but he never came back. After a few minutes, I decided to take a step inside, just to see if he was getting the money. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic set in as I heard the unmistakable sound of a lock clicking into place. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then, from deeper inside the house, I heard the whispering again. Only now it was accompanied by soft, shuffling footsteps. My heart was pounding as I turned around, looking for another way out. I spotted a side window and made a dash for it, but just as I was about to reach it, something grabbed my arm, yanking me back. I turned to see the man from before, his face twisted into a disturbing grin. I managed to break free and sprinted toward the back door, crashing through it with all my strength. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, jumping in and speeding away without looking back. My hands were shaking as I called my manager, explaining what had happened. He urged me to contact the police, which I did, but by the time they arrived, the house was completely empty. There was no sign of the man, no furniture, nothing. Just an abandoned building that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The police never figured out who the man was or what his intentions were. I quit my delivery job the next day, unable to shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than a simple robbery. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't managed to get away.